got was good, but it wasn't perfect. So the fact that there were all these options raised up my expectations, and the actual pair of genes I got failed to meet those absurdly high expectations. Next slide. So I don't want to romanticize the past, but the sense in which everything was better back when everything was worse is this. When things were worse, when conditions were, when we were less materially affluent, when we had less opportunity to make significant choices in every aspect of our lives, we had modest expectations. And when you have modest expectations, it's possible for your experiences actually to exceed those expectations. When your expectations go through the roof, the best you can do is break even with expectations, and most of the time you're going to end up disappointed. So the combination of regret, missed opportunities, and absurdly high expectations all conspire to make people less satisfied with the choices they make, even when they make good choices. And again, the way I think this is relevant specifically to your problem is that it is a long, hard slog to get through college. Often the people you're worrying about have multiple other demands on them. Just making ends meet is a challenge. They don't need anything distracting them, and they don't need anything undermining their enthusiasm. And this huge array of choices that many colleges offer to students will do both. It will distract them, make them put way too much energy into deciding and not enough into executing, and it will make them less satisfied with the decisions they make and thus less likely to continue. Okay, next slide. We're hitting in the home stretch now. The question is, how can choice be good and bad? Because you will remember, I said 20 minutes ago that we all know that choice is good. And the mistake that people have made is to assume that it's only good. I've been describing the respects in which choice is bad. So how can we understand choice as good and as bad? Next slide. This is a sort of conceptual graph. On the x-axis is the number of choices, and on the y-axis is how people feel. The line across the middle is neutral. And so all the way along the y-axis, you can see that when people have no choice, life is infinitely bad. As you give people options, trivial ones like what kind of cereal to buy, important ones like where to live and what kind of work to do, as you give people options, their satisfaction with life, their subjective state goes up. Would you put the graph back on the screen? But you'll notice that it's a curve. It's not a straight line. Said another way, there is diminishing marginal benefit to choice. A point is reached where adding one more option just doesn't do much. The curve flattens out. Nonetheless, there's no question that as you increase choice, people's lives get better. Okay, next slide. Now I've added a second curve. And this curve is meant to capture all the negatives, the paralysis, the bad decisions, and the dissatisfaction with good decisions. And what you'll see is that when there aren't too many choices, those negatives don't amount to much. But as the number of options increases, the negatives also increase, and the increase accelerates. The bads get more and more bad as the number of options goes up. So you've got the good effects of choice and the bad effects of choice. And the question is, how does it feel to have any given amount of choice? And the next slide will give you the answer. What happens is that when you go from no choice to some choice, you make life better. And as you then enhance choice, give people more and more, the curve changes direction. And if you torture people enough with so many options, not only does the curve change direction, but it actually goes below zero. That is to say, it goes from positive to negative. And I think for most people living in modern America, we are way on the right-hand side of that graph. So the trick is to figure out how much choice will enable you to take advantage of what's good and minimize the bad. In other words, how do we find the sweet spot, the point on that curve where the objective state is as high as possible? And the answer to that is nobody knows. There have been a few studies done where you vary the number of options people have. Some people have 2, some have 4, some have 8, some have 15. And those studies suggest that the sweet spot is somewhere around 6 or 8 options. But those are studies where the choices are trivial, like choosing a pen or not. Whether the same magic number is the right number when it comes to significant choices is anybody's guess. But I think it is worth doing the empirical analysis to figure out how much choice is enough to make people feel liberated and autonomous without torturing them and inducing them to make bad decisions. And that's the amount of choice that ought to be available in curriculums and most other areas of life. Next slide. So, what do we do if we're not going to give people unlimited choice, right? I mean, this is a society that is built on the central importance of freedom of choice. Is there a way that we can give people choice, but help them so that the choices they make are the choices they should make? And the answer to that is yes. Cass Sunstein, who is now in the Obama administration, but in his prior life was a law professor at Chicago and now at Harvard, and Richard Thaler, a very distinguished economist at Chicago, wrote a paper some years ago called "Libertarian Paternalism is Not an Oxymoron." Libertarian paternalism is not a contradiction in terms. Libertarian is all about freedom, freedom, freedom. Paternalism is all about let me decide I know better than you. It sounds like a contradiction in terms. They suggest that it's not. And I commend to you a book that they wrote in 2009 called Nudge, which lays out this position that I'm about to describe very quickly and provides lots of examples. Their argument is we shouldn't force people to do things in most areas of life. We should make choice available, but we should pay enough attention to what they call the choice architecture so that people will end up choosing what we know they want. They will manage not to suffer from their paralysis, because if they are paralyzed, they end up getting something that's good for them. So what this centers on is the notion of the default, the notion of what happens when people do nothing. So the sort of paradigm case to show the importance of worrying about what happens when people do nothing is the phenomenon of organ donation. In the United States, when you ask people if they are in favor of organ donation, you get virtually 100% in favor of organ donation, high 90s. Nonetheless, the percentage of Americans who are actually organ donors hovers around 25. Everyone thinks it's a great idea, but only 25% of people actually do it when they renew their driver's licenses. Why? Well, they're busy, it's hard. In order to be an organ donor, you've got to check a box and sign a form. Who has time for that? In any event, it is a massive shortage of available organs. Next